We are live.
We're live.
We're live. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this live stream. Thank you so much for watching. I want to thank my Patreon supporters for making channels like mine possible and for making awesome interviews with awesome guests possible and free for everyone else out there who benefits from them. Speaking of our awesome guests today, we have Dr. William J. Webb. He is an adjunct professor of New Testament and Biblical Studies at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Ontario. He is the author of Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals, as well as Corporal Punishment in the Bible. And we also have Gordon K. Oeste. He is the adjunct professor of Old Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto and teaching pastor at Cedar Creek Community Church, Cambridge, Ontario. He's the author of Legitimacy, Illegitimacy, and the Right to Rule. And last month we had Dr. Gordon Nickel from Canada. Next month we have Dr. Andy Bannister back with us. He lived in Canada for quite some time. So I think that Canadians are infiltrating my channel, and I just want you to know that I am on to you. Most importantly for that interview,
that's awesome, eh?
We are in exile from the promised land.
I turned the heat down in my house just so I could sympathize with you all. Most importantly for this interview, they have authored the book Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric, ? Wrestling with Troubling War Texts, and that was published in... I see the snow. Yeah.
You see the 12-foot snowbank out there? Yeah. Okay. That's where we are. Yeah.
That's not 12 feet. I believe that was hyperbole.
Yeah.
The viewers will get that joke in a little bit. So their book, Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric, Wrestling with Troubling War Texts, was published in December of 2019. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you, Colin.
I do want to say that links to the book are in the description box, Amazon US, UK, and Canada, as well as the publisher's website. And that's important because some supplementary materials are only available online. So this interview will function as a guide and an introduction to their methodology. So let's begin with your methodology. Of course, this topic of war text in the Bible and related topics has different approaches that different scholars take. So I wonder if you could start us off with giving us an overview of those approaches and how your approach compares and contrasts with those.
Do you want to go ahead, Bill?
You go ahead on methodology and I'll jump in.
Well, I guess in general, our methodology is we make a number of kind of core assumptions about the Bible and about the biblical text, and kind of, I guess, broad description of our methodology is redemptive movement hermeneutic. And there are, as you alluded to, Colin, there are a number of different approaches to the whole question of war in the Bible. And on the one end of the spectrum, there are some folks who read the biblical text very literally, and everything is exactly a one-to-one correspondence in terms of what we read, and war was bloody, brutal, and barbaric. It was not pretty, even though
we have a question mark in the title, there is no question in our mind.
Yeah.
It's more a flow into the second part of the title. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got so there's kind of people who read the text that way and kind of see a correspondence between kind of our modern questions about warfare and what we read in the Bible, and it kind of a very direct link. And then the other end of the spectrum might be folks who kind of read what they take what they read and kind of take it with a grain of salt, or maybe a whole heap full of salt and a pinch of salt, and just kind of go, yeah, it probably didn't happen. And, there's a lot of question marks there in terms of reading the text literally, and if there's any value there. And we try and kind of find a middle ground and try and kind of see that there are some helpful answers that what we've called the traditional approach kind of brings in terms of the Old Testament storyline, or the Hebrew Bible storyline. But at the same time, those questions that are answered in the biblical text in terms of the Old Testament storyline don't always correspond to the kinds of questions, to the kinds of things that people today are wrestling with when they come to the biblical text, like questions about wiping out entire people groups and genocide and things like that. So we're trying to kind of navigate a middle route. I don't know, Bill, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, this is Colin's question is on methodology. And what Gord has highlighted is that we have kind of a core methodology with respect to redemptive movement ethic, which alternatively could be called incremental ethic, that it moves incrementally downfield, the scrimmage markers down the field a little bit. The big game wasn't too long ago. And that's one central facet of the book. But in terms of method, we actually do a collage of methods. But Gord focused on the one that is perhaps most identifiable with Dr. William J. Webb. Love him or hate him, you know. So that is one aspect, but we bring in a number of we actually use an eclectic group of interpretive methods, biblical theology, canonical methodology, etc.
Comparison with the ancient Near East.
A lot of ancient Near Eastern comparative work. And really out of that, we bridge into 5, 6, 7 different thesis statements that we're trying to argue for in the book.
Can you tease out the redemptive movement hermeneutic a little bit more for us? That's probably a new phrase for most people.
Sure. Redemptive movement hermeneutic is where you start reading scripture through a lens to see what God is doing relative to the ancient setting that he is speaking into. So you're reading a text, and of course, for many people, just reading a text within its context is wonderful. You know, just to read the text within its literary context or genre context is wonderful. But also, we hear something quite different with the biblical text in terms of meaning when we listen to that text with the background noise, if you will, or the background informing what the meaning is. Okay, that background, that ancient social background, tells us a whole lot with respect to reading text. So, for example, I've worked extensively with slavery texts, with corporal punishment text, with text about women, etc., to show that many times these biblical texts don't use an ultimate ethic. They don't tell us, they don't take us all the way to heaven, if you will. They take us down the road or down the football field a little bit at a time ethically. So it's also called an incremental ethic, is another way to frame it. It's like you know, the authors of scripture and God's functioning within society doesn't always, with every sentence, throw a touchdown pass. Now, for some Christians, they think, oh, that can't be. It's God's word. It has to be ethically absolutist everywhere. Well, it isn't. And we should have known that because of someone who came on the scene, and his name was Jesus. And Jesus comes along and blows the disciples out of the water by saying to them, you know what? You just don't got that divorce thing down pat very well. You know, no, that's not ultimate ethic. You know, let me tell you something different. And so Jesus pushed the disciples to say, no, at least illustratively, much of scripture is written and not in an ultimate ethic, but with incremental movements towards that. because of the hardness of human heart, because of all kinds of factors that keep us from. I'm always stymied when I look around me at the various factors in our world, and we're trying to move environmentally, and and that's an ethical problem, not simply a destruction problem, because the people who get run over the most ethically are the poor. They can't buy the type of land that keeps them above water. They can't use all the masking and gear to filter out the pollution. The poor in our world are getting harmed the most. It is not simply keeping our planet going. That's a huge issue as well. But so that's illustrative of how long it's taking us to move away from dependency, for example, on fossil fuels. It's sometimes it feels like very small movements, but we often move in terms of incremental movements down the road, and that's whether that's true of our day, it's also true of the ancient texts. So when we sense that there's some kind of movement meaning. What's that?
You talk about ethical movement.
Yes. Yes, yeah. Ethical movement. Yeah. So some of the aha moments where we were so excited in working with these texts, which are bloody, brutal, and barbaric, were where we saw, yes, but what kind of a world is God speaking into with this material? And once you listen to the text within its contextual world, all of a sudden you hear, ooh, this is exciting. This is not. This is actually has a beautiful turn to it within the ugliness of the ancient war world.
Yeah, Mark chapter 10 is I think a good example. And Jesus said to them, just what you referenced earlier, because of the hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So that does seem to be a specific example of not the ultimate ethic, but a progressive or an accommodating ethic. I want to bring something that Gord mentioned back into the picture, and you as well, Bill, and that is the literal reading, and I don't even like using that word, because of what is a literal reading for us was not a literal reading for people thousands of years ago. So something that's very important to do is to bring in that ancient Near Eastern context, which you and others have brought and collected and systematized and given to us. And you say that you can see this redemptive movement in several texts, and I want to refer to one of them, known for the viewers. It's known as the Pretty Woman text. This is the text in Deuteronomy 21:10-14. I won't read it, but the point is that an Israelite soldier sees an attractive woman. He wants to marry her. He brings her home, shaves her hair, trims her nails. There's a period of mourning, and then he can marry her. And this strikes many of us as what would be not bloody, not brutal, but perhaps barbaric.
Very much so.
But you say that in your book that this is an example of some ethical progression, and you use ancient Near Eastern background to make that case. So I know I've just opened a can of worms, but would you like to take that can and do something with it?
You want us to go fishing with your can of worms? Okay, that's a very troublesome text, and in terms of the advancement of ethical assessment within our setting today, that text would be considered war rape. The legislation on what is considered war rape, that would definitely fall in there. So I'm going to hand this off to Gord to start off with. You take a swing at it, Gord, or put some worms on the hook, see if you can't have some fun with it.
I can do a bit of that, and then I'll pass it back to you. But so right now, when you read that text, it's not very pretty. As it stands, an Israelite warrior after battle can choose a woman, and after a 1 month period, bring her into his house and marry her. And
he chooses her on what basis, Gord?
based upon her outward appearance. That's as far as the text in Deuteronomy 21 goes. It's kind of what you see is crucial. It's not, there's no relational connection there. There's no, dating period where you get to know each other and see whether you're compatible or anything like that. It doesn't work that way at all. It's the Israelite warrior in this text can, see somebody after a battle and thinks, she looks attractive, and then as kind of booty, I suppose it would be, can take her into his house. And so, at the very surface level, that's not great at all.
And there is no consent. So this is not necessarily, maybe in a few cases consensual, but very wobbly kind of positioning to argue that.
Yeah, and particularly, and this is true even today, but maybe even more so in an ancient world, women had so little control and power over their situation, and this seems to exemplify that. But then when we began to look at some other pieces to that scenario, as much as there's an ugly side to that, there's also a redemptive side to that when we begin to look both within the ancient cultural setting and within some other biblical contexts, and within the biblical provisions. In general, in the ancient world, battlefield rape was the norm. Now, most texts don't talk about it a whole lot. There's a few places where there's mention of it explicitly, but it seems to have been such a difficult thing, and kind of one of those don't tell anybody kind of things, although everybody knows that it's happening. And so battlefield rape seems to have been, as far as we can see, the norm, that continues on even today until we've got net laws now that try and legislate that and try and preempt that. But those laws, certainly at our modern day level, weren't in place back in biblical times. But one of the things that that we see that happening in Deuteronomy 21, there's a number of beautiful, I guess I call them beautiful. They're beautiful in the sense of they put some restrictions on what can happen. As Bill was saying, that text doesn't move the ball all the way to the goal line. But what it does do is it puts some restrictions around what Israelite warriors can and can't do. So one of them is a 1 month waiting period. Rather than in the heat of battle, a man taking a woman, the Bible says, no. And one of the things that we find throughout the Bible is that there is no battlefield rape allowed whatsoever.
Can I just do a side story on that? Part of the side story on that, which is really cool, is that the Ark of the Covenant goes with the army into battle. And so the same issues about sexuality, no sex was allowed, not even domestic marital sex, while for the warriors, and let alone any sex with those who are not Hebrew. And so here is the fascinating connection between temple sexuality, where Israel was not permitted sexuality within temple worship. That was taboo. And when they were not permitted, the ark goes out with them, the ark comes back with them. And the norm of war rape on the battlefield was not permitted. So one huge distancing, and once we, the ancient Near East, it was likely prolific. Once we get to the Greco-Roman times, it becomes, in terms of their artistry, and it came out of the box, even more. So that's a huge difference like right there, let alone the fact that, and of course, what happens, Gord, I'll let it come back to you, but what happens when, what happens if the warrior doesn't like her?
Yeah, if so once he chooses this woman, there's a 1 month waiting period, and we can talk a little bit more about that 1 month waiting period. But at the very least, it seems to be this cooling off period where there is, it's a cooling off period and a time to that allows for the woman potentially to grieve. She's lost her family. She's lost her potentially her cultural context, her many of the things that are familiar to her, and in that 1 month period, the Bible gives this person an opportunity to breathe, and to grieve, and to begin that mourning process, and then on top of that, there's this allowance that says that once this man takes her into his home, he can't divorce her at that point. He's not allowed to send her out of his home. So there are significant repercussions to the choice that if an Israelite warrior were to make that choice, there's repercussions to that play out in the long term. Bill, do you want to keep going?
Yeah. The inference is that God wants this marriage to work, but at the very end of the story is if he does divorce her, he is not permitted to sell her as a slave.
Right.
Well, that is like so far out of the norms of the day. If you're fighting for an Egyptian king and you come back and the king gives you a bunch of gives certain warriors, depending on your how you are in the stratosphere of the hierarchy, maybe just one good-looking woman, pick one, but many warriors got more than one, and you could do whatever you wanted, and you could have her as a concubine, you could have her as a wife, and if you wanted to divorce her, you could divorce her and sell her as a slave. That wasn't a problem at all. So it is in some respects a tacit move. It's not, I mean, we don't even hear it in because we're thinking Boko Haram, how is this in some respects different? I mean, this is we're looking at it from a culture and time where war rape is defined quite explicitly, and it's the development of ethic that has come about. But reading it within its social context, all of a sudden we hear this redemptive element, this movement, that Aslan is on the move. And, it's slowly moving from this Canadian winter to melt the snow, and something's happening redemptively.
I think in your book, and just to make this very clear for the viewers, you actually compare war rape to sort of a victory dance for the enemies. And that would have been something explicitly forbidden in Israelite practice because of this text in Deuteronomy 21. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the clearest war rape victory dance that we get within Scripture are certainly some of the later allusions by the prophets to they will be lifting your skirts, etc. But in the Judges text of I think it's Judges 5. Yeah, Judges 5, and where there now it's the Israelite putting their mock in the words of Sisera's mama, the great general Sisera. Mother might be dead at that time, and they don't have an Israelite outpost underneath the lattice listening in. This is a poetic mock where she's crying out, why is my baby not coming home? Talk about, I mean, it's just dripping with irony. why is my baby not coming home? And to her, ironically, with the wisest of her ladies answers her, well, it's because they just have so much loot and booty in the double entendre sense. A man or two for each, or pardon me, a woman or two, a rachum, actually, which is, if you pick up a slutty term in English where body parts are put for the whole woman, that would be comparable. Something in a high school locker room that you might hear in terms of speaking of women. And, which has sexual and procreative overtones.
And then I guess Bill froze.
No. Were you jumping in, Gord?
Nope. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So I'll keep going. So this is, why is she doing that? Well, that's a positive statement right here. The glory is that they've got all these women that they're going to ravish, basically. They'll ravish them there. They'll take them home. They'll, you can have a perpetual concubine or a perpetual sex slave, whatever you want to do with them. And the fact that it's a very sexualized text is that the parody in the text happens with Jael later. She sends the tent peg through a soft skin, not unlike a hymen, and pounds, and he falls dead, and he dies and dead. It's a very interesting poetic framing. But that parody is to say what they thought they were going to do to Israelite women, and to conquer and take these women. They actually had a woman, an Israelite woman, do to them, i.e., their general.
What that does is it just highlights in a kind of in a parodying way, kind of what was typically the norm in the ancient Near East, and it turns it on its head. And then when read in conjunction with Deuteronomy 21, it really says, it's kind of Israel's God saying, we're not going that way. We're gonna put boundaries around what you're allowed to do on the battlefield, and in contrast to what seems to have been the norm in the ancient Near East. And so that's part of that redemptive movement kind of thing that we see going on in that area, or with that topic.
Can I get excited about that? Yes.
a lot of viewers won't be aware that what goes on there with the tent peg. I mean, there are a couple of journal articles that have been produced on this. And just like Bill and Gord are saying, it's a poetic reversal of what would have been done to the Israelite women. So, yeah, that's you'll have to get the book for more details on that. Let's open up another can of worms, and this is fascinating. You address numerous total kill passages. We see this in Deuteronomy, we see them in Joshua, we see them in 1 Samuel, and we'll talk about some of those specifically, but just in the bigger picture, you gentlemen have an incredible amount and variety of ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole in your book. And so I was wondering if you could just take us outside of the biblical sources for a couple of minutes and give us some examples of what kind of war rhetoric that is relevant to these total kill passages.
I can do that. So, and much of this, or some of this, much of this isn't new to us. Actually, the person who really kind of blazed the trail on this topic was, in terms of kind of comparing biblical war accounts and battle accounts with what we find in the ancient Near East, is a scholar by the name of K. Lawson Younger, who in 1990 kind of blazed a trail, and he looked at specifically Joshua chapter 6 to 9 and compared that with other ancient Near Eastern battle accounts. And then we've kind of taken some of his things and built upon that and adapted it and added some things to it. And what you begin to see is that throughout the ancient Near East, the norm was that whenever there was a battle that was won, people would boast about it. And in particular, one of the facets of kind of the way that you would report about battle to your audience is that you would talk some smack, to use some a colloquialism, right? You're talking trash, and you kings would kind of really pump themselves up and inflate the size of their victory. So, for example, there's a number of times where you see this in a number of different ways. One of them is, for example, I think it's King Ramses the Second in the Battle of Kadesh, where he's battling against a coalition of Hittite forces and others. And in his account of that story, he talks about how he fought and how he was such a fearsome warrior that no one could stand against him, even though he was fighting against millions and hundreds of thousands of opponents. No one stood up to him. And then in another passage, in another description of that battle, he talks about how, he kind of fought everybody all on his own. It's like he was left alone on the battlefield, and he was the one kind of, holding everyone back.
Didn't even have to use his armies.
All by himself. And when historians go back and when we look at the results of the Battle of Kadesh, what Ramses describes as a complete and utter victory ends up being a draw. And we know that from a little bit of some descriptions from Ramses himself, but also some from Hittite descriptions and others, where we know that Ramses retreated, and some of the places that he retreated to, we know that he lost territory rather than gaining territory coming out of that battle. That's one example. A really clear one that relates to the biblical text is an Egyptian pharaoh who says that he kind of campaigned in the Levant, in the area of the Middle East, in where Israel is now, and conquered a whole bunch of places. And among them, he lists Israel, and particularly, this is Pharaoh Merneptah. Pharaoh Merneptah says that Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. And in the reference to his seed there, he's talking about Israel as a people group, and saying that their seed, their children, does not exist any longer. And that's clearly hyperbolic, because we know this is Merneptah's writing somewhere around, just for round number's sake, I'll ballpark it at about, if I remember right, I think it's 1200 BC, ballpark, if I remember right. And we know from that Israel continued on, and that there was a people group that continued where Pharaoh Merneptah, in the space where Pharaoh Merneptah describes them, and they were not wiped out, they were not annihilated. They continued and grew to become a people group, and eventually under King Saul and then King David and Solomon grew to become a nation. And that's just one kind of hyperbole that we find. There's all kinds of other ones, including speed. Sometimes, there's one of the Assyrian kings talks about this campaign where he, in the space of a single day, he covers what's the equivalent of about 250 miles or so. And we know there's no, 250 miles in your car is not too bad a distance to cover, but if you're on horseback or if you're walking, there's no possible way you can cover that in the span of a single day. And so that kind of language to describe warfare and one's exploits and victories in battle was all over the place. Now, Colin, do you want me to connect that with some examples from the biblical text as well, or do you want to poke around with that?
Let me just brag on Gord a little bit. Can I brag on Gord? I
Yes,
got into writing
excursus now. This is the brag on Gord excursus. Go ahead.
This is the brag on Gord excursus. I got into writing this book for 7 years, and I kept hitting this wall, and I kept saying, "Whoa! If only I had someone working with me who, breathed, ancient Near Eastern war texts." And Gord and I crossed paths, and we started talking about this. And Gord had similar insight in terms of incremental ethic issues, and we both saw this as hyperbole. And so we said we want to produce a work that argues the strongest case within the biblical text for hyperbole. So we did bring, and Gord brought the A&E material in, but also huge evidence beyond where it's been developed so far in terms of what's going on in the biblical text. And I love what he's done in a number of spots that I just couldn't have done on my own. And so we've pushed each other in various areas, and this is one that I'm so happy to see Gord developing, and I think it's frankly one of the strongest published cases. Now we honor the people whose shoulders we stood on, like
big time.
Younger.
Our colleague, I think he's retired now, but Younger. Yeah, and very thankful for that. But then, we have tried to develop a much stronger biblical case within the biblical text as well, and we wager a bet in the holy sense of no money involved, but we wager a bet. It is our hope and prayer that in 20 years, pastors will preach these texts quite differently. They will understand the ethics of these texts quite differently. And this is one huge area, and that is the area of hyperbole.
So given what we just heard from Gord, this is Joshua 10, 38 and 39. This is just one of numerous examples you cite. Then Joshua and all Israel with him turned back to Devere and fought against it, and he captured it with its king and all its towns, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and devoted to destruction every person in it. He left none remaining. And then Judges 1:11, recall that Judges 1 begins after the death of Joshua. So this is verse 11 from chapter 1. From there, they went against the inhabitants of Devere.
Right.
And I know a lot of scholars who haven't considered the hyperbole thesis really have some chronology issues here between Joshua and Judges. Because, well, Joshua says this, and this happens numerous times, as you cite in your book. Joshua says this, Judges says this. On the face of it, this is a contradiction. So how do we deal with the chronology of these texts and so forth? But you would say something like, well, we have the same war rhetoric, the hyperbole, in Joshua that we have in other places in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, and in other places outside of Joshua. So we have that same war rhetoric in Joshua, where we've got, even within the book of Joshua itself, we've got places that are that Joshua conquers, like Gibeon and Hebron, and there's a number of other places like that in Joshua 10, in Joshua 11. And then as we keep reading in Joshua 17, for example, all of a sudden Joshua and Caleb, as Joshua's parceling out the land to each of the different tribes, these tribes have to go and conquer cities in those same areas where just a few chapters beforehand, we were told that they conquered not only that city, but if you keep reading, I forget whether it's just before that verse that you read, Colin, or if it's just after that, but right at the end, I think it's just after that in Joshua 10 verses 40 to 43, if I'm not mistaken. It says not only did Joshua conquer, this city and that city, but the summary statement there says that he conquered the whole area and left no one alive. And yet, when we keep going in later on in the book of Joshua, we see that there's still people to be conquered there. And then the same thing happens in Judges, where we find that same kind of evidence that there's still more people to be conquered. And then we even find that same kind of language where, everyone will be destroyed, everyone will be wiped out in some of the prophetic texts in later on in the Bible. And we know from history that there was no immediate correspondence between that. They eventually, some of those people groups eventually faded off the pages of history, but they weren't annihilated in the way that the biblical text describes. And we read that not as an error in the biblical text, but a common way in which people throughout the ancient Near East described battle and the results of battle using hyperbole.
And so one purpose of this hyperbole, just in general, would be to glorify the king.
Yeah.
In this case, this hyperbole would be as a testimony to Joshua, his prowess as a commander, glory to God, or
up a little further.
Okay.
Both of those, Joshua and to Joshua's God.
Right.
I was wondering to the ancient readers, if we didn't see Joshua's victories described this way, if they would have seen him as being a commander than, say, a king whose victories were described with such rhetoric. That might be reading too much into it. But what would you say about what actually happened? Okay, so we have examples of hyperbole, and like you said, that was Joshua 10:40. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings, and so forth, left none remaining, devoted to destruction.
Right.
So what did actually happen, as far as we can tell?
Do you want to run with that, Bill, or?
Sure, because there's a nice rollover from that answer into the ethics of this whole thing. But what Gordon and I would propose actually happened was, and we'll give a probability scale here, was number one, the king was killed.
Right.
Okay, and that was very important, because the king then, once slain by the sword, was put on a post so that everybody could see, oh, our king is gone, kind of like putting up a white flag on behalf of your enemy. But they took the king down before nightfall and buried the king. I want to come back to that. So that for certain happened. Beyond that is lesser probability. Anything that remained a military threat was probably dealt with. So armies that kept fighting despite the death of the king. But we're not talking all the inhabitants of the cities and all that kind of thing. It was that the city as a military threat had fallen. And that was maybe that would involve some of the family members who could easily resurrect or bring about, dare I say the word, an insurrection. But it meant a whole lot more limitation on what happened, rather than, and the soldiers ran around and killed the women, children, the elderly, the lame, the begging lepers. They slaughtered them all, and the babies even, Imagine being an Israelite warrior and having to go and kill babies. Disgusting. And yet some people also think that there's a correlation between these texts and what Jesus is going to do eschatologically. That's quite a cute argument, but I can't quite imagine Jesus as eschatological warrior ever doing something like that. Okay, another page in the book. But here's the important ringer for ethics. What that gives us is a zero baseline in terms of this is what happened, not the hyperbole. And then we say, okay, well then, what is redemptive? This is what happened probably in many cases in the ancient Eastern world. But then what is redemptive within the biblical text? And that especially gets developed in the chapter on ancient war atrocities, where what does Israel do with the most hated character in the opposing army? Well, the most hated character, which focused anger, is on the king, is on the leader of that warring faction. You get them, and you take them, and you make a spectacle of them. The Assyrians were great at not only taking them, but the leadership of cities, stretching them out, staking them down, and skinning, taking the skin off like you would an animal, the hide. And then they made chairs and other things to put in their vestibules as you came in to see their great exploit. Well, many of them were staked, and even some of the soldiers would be staked on posts and hung to die, impaling. And the impaling would go up various crevices of the body. It is disgusting. They found more ways to torture and torment people. In that chapter, I had to shut that chapter down researching it over and over again because I started getting nightmares. And the things that they would do and what does Israel do? Okay, to the most hated and the person you would devastate the most after a victory is the king. Okay, to that king, they kill the king with the sword. They display the king is dead. White flag for you guys. Put away your weapons, and then they have to bury the king by sunset. Well, okay, the whole burial strategy in ancient Eastern warfare was part of the horrors of it. I couldn't quite get it for many years. I would see all these artistic depictions of the ancient world in fighting, and I would see the armies throwing dead bodies into rivers, the dead bodies of their opponents. And as I started getting into burial rituals and how they work, that was to really, psychologically, you don't only kill the army, you kill the army over and over and over again, and the people. You don't let them, you kill them, and then you don't let their bodies go back for burial to their people.
It's
That's huge.
Warfare, in addition to actual physical warfare, right? That's just
there's this huge component of psychological warfare. There are stelas and pictures and engravings with soldiers holding a mace over the head of their enemies, making their enemies find the burial boxes for their loved ones and grind them up into powder. You had to unbury your loved one. This is the psychology. These are all the things that happen after war, after they've even won. And there's none of this in Scripture. And what it says is, you know how you treat that king? You kill him with the sword. You don't impale him. You kill him with the sword, then you show that you've killed him. And then by sunset, you bury him.
Which still sounds brutal today.
Well, it sounds brutal today, but in that world, no. You have to go through the museum walk of which is what I call it in that chapter of ancient war atrocities, and that's the context where you start hearing this redemptive movement of our text in the historical or ancient context of war. And that's gets me excited because that's redemptive movement. Once we've zeroed out on the hyperbole stuff, and if we can just do a kicker on the hyperbole stuff, because sometimes there's a response by some Christians to say, well, God wouldn't exaggerate, or the biblical writer, that would be wrong, and what's helpful sometimes is for people to hear ourselves and evaluate that. I'll do one on Marilyn, my wife, and Gord can do one off of sports. But for example, Marilyn, after a good number of years of watching me slave away on this book, said to me when it was finished, Bill, why did it take you forever to write, this book on bloody, brutal, and barbaric? It took you forever. And I looked at her with surprise and shock. That was more just to play her a little bit. But I said to her, it didn't take me forever, honey. It only took me 14 years. And this is dangerous. But I started to unpack with her a conversation about the emotive meaning in that language. And that's why we turn in our culture many times. When my wife says that something took me forever to do, she has some emotive feeling in there. So we actually had an extended conversation on, okay, tell me why you feel that way. And that's where something happens, but we use hyperbole to say something far richer and deeper in terms of the emotive content. And for Israel and Israel's God, this was a very important stuff, because Yahweh did not want Israel to be following other gods, this was very much a battle zone against that. And so when you think of it that way, all of us can realize that to our spouse at times we use hyperbole, and we're not lying. They don't understand it as lying or exaggeration. Gord, any other context?
Just to circle back to your initial question about what was going on, or what were they saying by using this? And I think the intention behind describing battles this way, in part, was, you're right, Colin, to glorify the king, and to glorify, in many cases, the deity connected with that king. But the other thing that it did say, rather than kind of that you've got, a mass slaughter or genocide going on, the intent behind using that emotive kind of language to describe a battle victory is what lies underneath that is basically, it's really simplistically, but it's a way of saying it was a sound victory. One side didn't just kind of eke out a victory over the other one, but that there was that they defeated them so that they were militarily, really no longer a threat. So we use that same kind of hyperbole today. And we know, just to build on what Bill was saying, in many cases today, we know, depending on who we're listening to, how to interpret the words that are used. So, for example, if you're listening to a newscast and you hear a reporter say that, that Boko Haram wiped out, people in northern Nigeria, a village, and there were 26 people that died. We hear that, and we would grieve at hearing those words. And we would think of 26 people who had lost their lives that day. But then, just a little bit later, when the sportscaster comes on and the sportscaster says, I'll use a Super Bowl analogy, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers annihilated, or they wiped out the Kansas City Chiefs, we know how to interpret that and go, well, there was no bodies left on the field dead after that. That's a way of saying that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers soundly defeated the Kansas City Chiefs. Any apologies to Chiefs fans out there? And so the reason why that kind of language is used in the Bible seems to be one of the reasons seems to be this way of kind of declaring a significant defeat, rather than a way of saying or describing genocide or mass executions happening that go, all the way from top to bottom in a village or in a society.
So this would explain, I think, the focus on the king in 1 Samuel 15. You have this order once again for complete extermination against the Amalekites.
Right.
And then Saul comes. And one thing that's puzzled me about this text is we see the same thing that we do within Joshua, and then comparing Joshua to Judges. The Amalekites are still there. They're there in chapter 27 and chapter 30. They're there later on. And it really makes, if the command were literal, it makes Samuel look quite ignorant, because he apparently doesn't know that Saul did not completely annihilate these people, but his focus is on the king. And I think that John Walton has made similar arguments regarding the identity of the king and the identity of the people and the importance of the king in these contexts. So what Samuel would have heard, or what Saul would have heard from Samuel, is you are to soundly defeat the Amalekites, and this defeat would involve, like you said, a probability statement, the king, and perhaps some of the royal family. And it's something else that you guys point out that's interesting also is that this language occurs, just like with Merneptah, in against Israel. And so Jeremiah 25 is a place where God says to Judah, he will devote them to destruction.
Right.
And so this, once again, Judah, this would have been a warning that would have been heeded as a defeat is coming. And the everlasting desolation, once again, would have evoked a more of an emotive response within the people to perhaps heed Jeremiah's warning.
Exactly. And that's
those prophetic texts. Reverse all of the reverse holy war, as well as continued holy war against Israel at times in both of the huge defeats that led to captivity.
Yeah, just to tweak something that Bill said, or build on what Bill said, is that some of the same language that's used to describe what the Israelites were supposed to do is then used in prophetic texts to talk about what Assyria and Babylon would do to Israel. And, in that case, yes, Israel or Judah was soundly defeated, but they weren't completely annihilated in the way that we might think, the way when we read the language at its surface level. So that's a great example of that. And
this reverse holy war plays into the bigger literary picture, the meta narrative that you describe in your book, with the ethnic Canaanites and the literary Canaanites, and this continuing pattern of God making sacred space. Gentlemen, I'm privileged to have some really good guests on this channel, and one thing that's in common with all of them is that an hour goes by very quickly. But I just wanted to give you a chance to offer any closing comments. I know your time is very valuable, and I want to keep to our time commitments. So we have a lot of loose ends, of course, and I'm encouraging people to go to the description box and check out your book to help tie up some of those loose ends. But if you do have any closing or concluding comments, please have at it.
Why don't I start, and then Bill, you can conclude. One of the other things that we didn't, that was really for both Bill and I, that was so helpful, was a segment where one of the chapters in the book where we explore these what seem to be anti-war texts, where at one level, it seems like God is encouraging Israel to do this. But on the other hand, we see a whole slew of other texts where God takes the norm and kind of takes the legs out from it, everything from kind of the macho warrior culture, and undoes that in various passages in the Bible, to things where the norm. Just one example of this: normally kings, when they defeated a people group, they would boast about it, and then they would build a temple to celebrate that, and then they would, and then they, and number three is that then they would.
Is this the build? I'm sorry, battle, boast, and build that you
battle, boast, and build. Yeah, there you go.
Such a
alliteration, right? But and they would boast about it, and when you see, again, when you go back to the ancient Near Eastern context and you see what, for example, the Egyptians inscribed, the pictures that they that they draw on their temples, where you're walking past these places when you go in to worship the various the Egyptian deities, and you see collections of hands and other body parts, or Egyptian kings with their maces held over captives' heads, ready to whack them, and then the deity in the background. It's almost like watching and approvingly watching. And then you come to the biblical context of worship and sacred space, and the temple. The iconography in the temple, Israel's temple, you've got, instead of battle scenes, what you've got palm trees, pomegranates, and little geometrical figures and that kind of thing. There's no hint of any battle victory celebrations at all. And then to boot, Israel's greatest warrior king, or most celebrated warrior king, is David. And yet, when it comes time to build the temple, God says, no, David, you're not going to build the temple. You've got blood on your hands. And so in Chronicles, there's 2 passages in Chronicles where God says, you're not going to build the temple. Instead, your son, who is the man of peace, Shalomo, a play off of the Hebrew word shalom, the man of peace. He's the one who builds the temple. And so this contrast between, what happens throughout much of the ancient Near East, where the king is celebrates his victories with these, these gory descriptions and pictures of what happened on the battlefield. And then you contrast that with what we find in the Bible. And it's a very, very stark contrast that says, where Israel's God is saying, no, that's not the way we do things here. And we uncovered a whole raft of other passages that kind of move in that same direction, that, like you said, Colin, there's lots of loose ends, and there's so many more we'd love to talk about, because they really are fascinating. And in many ways, they take the legs out from underneath the war culture of the Bible, and kind of move Israel in a less violent, more redemptive approach to warfare. It doesn't get all the way to the end, but it gets close. And I don't know, Bill, if you want to take us to the end of the Bible and the beautiful picture we see there.
Well, I could do, but it's quite a transition. There's a lot of things in sequencing, and this is a arrivederci sign off here, a quick goodbye. So I just want to highlight that beautiful reflection that interestingly comes in the time it comes in Chronicles, the critique of David as the warrior with bloody hands. I never learned that in Sunday school. Okay, I learned about David, the great warrior. God loved him. No, he's critiqued as, and it's interesting that this happens in Chronicles, which is, if you read Chronicles as the Bible going backwards, many have done that and do it well. They are in exile, thinking to themselves, "How did we get here?"
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How did we get here? Well, the story of how they got there are all the screw ups along the way, which started all the way back in Judges to picking a king. And God saying, no, don't do that, because, and he gets into all this discussion of this is going to create a war machine dependency and all this kind of things. And so they say to these Israelites, or God says to the Israelites, hey, you know what? I don't even want you having weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Well, that's for us, nuclear weapons, etc. But that's in their day, horses and chariots. So they're not supposed to do that. And Deuteronomy bans them from doing that. But what do we find Solomon doing? Building and getting horses and chariots. And so they're towards the end of exile, they're thinking and they're doing a reflection, particularly in Chronicles, which is a different David, because it has hope. What it's doing is casting hope for an eschatological David that's got a little bit more shalom in him. And it's some really cool stuff. And of course, that does connect with Jesus in wonderful ways.
Yeah.
So with that, I think we're going to leave more loose ends than ever. But Colin, just a delight to be on with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Once again, we've been hearing from William J. Webb and Gordon K. Oeste. See their book, Bloody, Brutal, and Barbaric, Wrestling with Troubling War Text. There are a whole bunch of links in the description box, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I will see you next time.
Thank you all.